The ink had dried on the pages before she sealed them, and the cold of the morning room in late November had made her fingers stiff enough that the wax seal pressed unevenly, the ducal crest she'd borrowed from her cousin's desk coming out lopsided and smeared at the left edge. She had not cared. She had sealed it anyway and placed it with the others in the outgoing post and gone back to her accounts, because there were tenant rents to reconcile, and the east wing chimney was drawing badly, and her cousin's creditors were not inclined toward patience. The letter, like the four before it, would travel north to Ashford Hall in Northumberland, and presumably arrive in the hand of a footman who would place it on a silver tray and carry it to a man who apparently found no reason to reply. That had been 5 years ago. The last letter, the fifth and final one. Cordelia Ashworth stood at the edge of the Carrington ballroom in December of 1817, holding a small notebook and a pencil stub, checking that the musicians had received their revised timing sheet, and tried not to think about what was standing at the top of the staircase across the room. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. The ballroom itself was the finest spectacle the autumn season had produced. 300 beeswax candles in chandeliers, strung with crystal that scattered light across the polished floor like broken water. Every mirror in the room angled to multiply the brightness, until the whole chamber seemed to vibrate with it. Lady Carrington's niece was being presented to society tonight, and Lady Carrington had spent 3 months and an amount of money that Cordelia privately knew could have resolved 2 outstanding mortgages, making certain the event could not be forgotten. There were hothouse roses arranged in towers at the 4 corners of the room, white against deep green. The orchestra was playing a contradance at exactly the tempo Cordelia had specified in the revised timing sheet, which meant someone had actually read it, which was more than she generally expected. Every invited guest had arrived in something luminous, silks and satins and carefully arranged pearl arrangements. The women scented with violet water and rose oil, the men pressed into dark tailcoats that showed the precise hierarchy of their tailors. And at the edge of all that brilliant excess, making a small notation about the 3rd dessert table, was Cordelia Ashworth. She wore gray. She had worn gray for 5 years, first in genuine mourning for her father, then out of habit, then out of the quiet principle that gray was the correct color for someone whose labor was meant to disappear into the background of other people's evenings. Her gown was clean and well-fitted because she was not without pride, but it had no ornament, no ribbon trim, no fashionable puffed sleeve. She was 31 years old, and she had organized 47 social events in 5 years, and she knew where every warming, chafing dish in the Carrington kitchens had been placed, and how many minutes the meringues could safely sit before they wept, and none of the 270 guests in this room knew her name. She had been managing crises before breakfast for so long that calm had become her natural state, like weather that had simply decided to hold. The man at the top of the staircase was tall, dark-coated, and motionless in a way that was different from how other men were motionless. Other men stood still because they were waiting for something to happen to them. He stood still as though he had already made all the relevant decisions and was simply allowing the world a moment to catch up. His hair was dark and he wore no military decoration, which meant he was letting the cut of his coat and the particular quality of his stillness speak for him, and they spoke clearly enough. She knew his face, though it had sharpened since she last saw it, the angles harder, the eyes set with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was not kindness. He was searching the room. He was searching it methodically, the way a man does when he is looking for something specific and is not entirely certain he will find it. She turned back to her notebook. The notation she made was precise. 3rd dessert table, 3rd warming dish, needs repositioning 6 inches left to clear the serving path. 11 numbers in the column she was maintaining. The musicians had shifted to a slower piece. Across the room she heard the particular sound of a conversation that had just changed temperature. the way a ballroom hushes when someone important has reached the floor, and she pressed the pencil stub against the page and did not look up. Then someone said her name, not her full name, not Miss Ashworth, just Cordelia, said with a quietness that had no performance in it, and she looked up because she had not heard her name said that way in a very long time, and the Duke of Ashford was standing 4 feet away from her, looking at her with the measuring attention of a man who had found exactly what he came to find. She did not smile. She did not step back. She straightened her spine and met his gaze and said, with perfect steadiness, "Your Grace, you are in the wrong part of the room. The receiving line is near the north door." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I know where the receiving line is. I am exactly where I intended to be." She had been doing invisible skilled labor at the edges of other people's lives for 11 years. She had carried her father's estate through his final illness and her cousin's household through 3 financial crises and 47 events through every conceivable disaster. And she was not, she had decided long ago, going to become less than she was, simply because no one was watching. She returned her attention to the notebook. He did not leave. Her father had been a man of moderate property and excellent judgment, and what he had built in Herefordshire was not grand, but it was sound. A wool merchant's income supplemented by timber rights and 3 working tenant farms. A house that ran well because he had taught Cordelia from the age of 14 to understand every ledger entry and every creditor negotiation and every repair estimate before she signed anything. He used to sit with her at the morning room desk after dinner and go through the accounts with the particular satisfaction of a man passing on something he genuinely loved, and she had absorbed it not as obligation, but as the natural language of how things worked. She learned that a household was a set of operating systems, financial, logistical, human, and that managing it well required the same attention as any serious intellectual endeavor. Her father had told her once that she had the most organized mind he had ever encountered, and she had filed that observation away in the same careful category as everything else useful. He died in the spring of 1811 when she was 26, and the property went to a distant male cousin she had met 4 times, and what her cousin inherited along with the house and the timber rights and the tenant farms was a woman who knew where everything was and how everything worked, and who was simply there, continuing to manage what needed managing, because the alternative was chaos, and chaos was not something she was willing to create. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like acknowledgement. Her cousin, Mr. Gerald Ashworth, was not a cruel man. He was simply the kind of man who accepted competent service as the natural order and did not consider it necessary to examine the source. He paid her nothing formally. They were family, he explained, with the particular confidence of someone who had decided the word covered a great many inconveniences. But she had room and board and access to the household accounts she was managing, and she had, in those first 2 years, tripled the working margin on the tenant farms by renegotiating 3 wool contracts that her cousin had signed at poor rates, recovered a £1,400 debt from a timber creditor who had been invoiced incorrectly for 2 years running, and turned the east wing from a storage liability into a letting income that covered the household's coal and candle expenditure entirely. Gerald had praised her once for her dedication. She had thanked him and returned to her desk. The Duke of Ashford had entered their lives in the summer of 1812, when he arrived in Herefordshire to survey the neighboring estate he had recently inherited, and her cousin had invited him to dinner as a matter of neighborly form, and Cordelia had organized the dinner and sat at the lower end of the table and said almost nothing. What she remembered of that evening was that he had looked at her twice, once when she redirected a footman who was about to place the wrong wine, and once, toward the end of the meal, when she had quietly corrected a figure her cousin had misquoted about the local grain yield. Both times his attention had been brief and measuring, like a note played in the wrong key that makes you stop and listen more carefully. There had been 6 dinners that summer. By the 3rd, he had begun directing questions toward her end of the table. By the 5th, they had sat for an hour after the others retired, talking about estate management with the particular pleasure of 2 people who have found someone else who speaks their language. By the 6th, she had let herself believe something she had been careful not to name. He had returned to Northumberland in September, and she had written him 5 letters over the following 2 years. They were not declaration letters. They were, in form, simply correspondence. About the Herefordshire wool yield, about a drainage problem she had solved on the eastern fields, about a novel she had read, and a question it raised about land tenure that she thought he might find interesting. They were the letters of a woman who had found a person worth writing to and had allowed herself the small liberty of continuing the conversation. The first 2 had received brief replies, 3 lines each, courteous and uninformative. The 3rd had received a single line acknowledging receipt. The 4th and 5th had received nothing. The silence had arrived like a verdict, delivered without appeal. She had written the 5th letter in November of 1814, the one with the uneven wax seal, and had gone back to her accounts, and had not written another, and had not permitted herself to revisit the question of why. She had managed it the way she managed everything difficult. She noted it, filed it in the category of things that were simply true, and redirected her attention to what could be acted upon. She was not going to step aside from her own life simply because one man had not found it worth answering. What she had not written, in any of the 5 letters, was that she was carrying his child. She had not written it for the same reason she had not gone north herself, or sent a messenger, or contrived a meeting, because she had been prepared to ask for nothing that required another person's willingness to give it, and because the decision to bring a child into the world was hers to make, and she had made it, with the same completeness with which she made all her decisions. She had been 31, not a young woman making a desperate plea. She had resources, small but real. She had a cousin who, when she told him, had been genuinely dismayed for approximately 48 hours, and had then settled into a pragmatic acceptance that was almost endearing in its lack of drama. The child was born in the summer of 1815, and she had named him Edmund, and he had his mother's dark red hair and Ashford's gray eyes, the exact gray, the precise shade that she had told herself for 2 years she had not memorized, and she had looked at him for a long time in that first hour, and then had decided, quite calmly, that he was the best thing she had built, and that she was going to do right by him with exactly the same competence she brought to everything else. Edmund was 2 years old now and currently asleep in the Carrington nursery with the maid who traveled with Cordelia on working evenings, and he had learned to say 14 words and could already point accurately at a ledger page when she read numbers aloud, which she took as evidence of sound inherited instincts. There had been one moment, in the small hours of a night in that first winter when Edmund was 3 months old, and the cold had come in under the window frame, and she could not get the fire to draw, when she had pressed her hand against the plaster wall, and stood for a moment, absolutely still, and had allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was carrying, not with bitterness and not with grief. Those were emotions that required a certain narrative she had declined to adopt, but simply with the accurate knowledge of what it cost. Then she had repacked the window frame with cloth, rebuilt the fire from scratch with the method she had learned from the estate keeper, and gone back to her accounts. She had survived harder things than silence. The report had been thorough. Ashford had hired a man named Porter, who had 20 years of investigative work for estates across England and the particular skill of finding information that resided in the spaces between official records. Porter had located the child in 6 weeks. His report was in the breast pocket of Ashford's tailcoat, folded in quarters, though by now he did not need to read it. He had read it enough times that it had become part of the architecture of his understanding of the last 5 years. The child's name was Edmund Gerald Ashworth, born August 1815. Hair, dark red, eyes, gray, currently residing in the house of Gerald Ashworth of Herefordshire, acknowledged as the natural son of Miss Cordelia Ashworth. The report gave the date of birth with the precision of a court document, and Ashford had sat with that date for a long time after reading it, working backward through the months, and had arrived at the summer of 1812 with the particular sensation of a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through everything he had believed was settled. He had been in his study at Ashford Hall in Northumberland for 3 years following that summer, and he had understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has made a mistake he cannot undo by understanding it better, what the years of silence had looked like from the other side. His mother had died in the spring of 1810, and what she left behind was not simply grief but a specific kind of damage, the sense that attachment produced catastrophic loss on a reliable schedule, and that the correct response to any situation that engaged his deeper nature was to withdraw into the operational intelligence he trusted and seal the rest below the surface, like armor rusting beneath the coat. He had come to Herefordshire in the summer of 1812 because the estate required inspection, not because he had been looking for anything. He had left in September because Northumberland required him and because he had been afraid, with the particular cowardice of a man who would not have named it that at the time, of what he had begun to feel at that lower end of a dinner table. He had answered 2 of her letters because they were excellent letters, and he could not quite stop himself. And then he had stopped, telling himself it was the responsible thing, that he had nothing to offer and the distance was real, and better to close the door cleanly than to continue something that had no sanctioned form. He had not known about the child. He understood now that this was not a defense. It was simply a fact, and it sat alongside the other facts in the precise arrangement they deserved. He had spent one evening in October listening to a woman play Haydn on the pianoforte at a London dinner party, and had watched her perform competently, while feeling nothing except the accurate recognition that the performance was competent, and had thought, without intending to, of a woman at the lower end of a Herefordshire dinner table who had corrected a grain yield figure with complete composure, and then returned to her soup. And he had understood that he had been for 3 years simply going through the rooms of his life as though they were obligations to be completed, and that the reason they felt like obligations was because he had left behind the one thing that had made them feel like something else. He had commissioned Porter's report the following morning. He had not come to the Carrington ball because Lady Carrington had invited him, though she had. He had come because Porter had noted, in a postscript, that Miss Cordelia Ashworth was employed by several of London's leading household establishments as an event organizer and would be found most reliably at the Carrington event on the 3rd of December. He had arrived at 10 o'clock, stood at the top of the staircase, and searched the room the way he searched everything, methodically, starting at the edges. She had been at the 3rd dessert table, making a notation in a small notebook, wearing gray. He did not leave the edge of the room after she looked back at her notebook. He stood, not intrusively close, at a position that gave her the ability to ignore him if she chose, and after a moment she said, without looking up, "If you are waiting for me to be surprised that you have come, you will wait some time. Porter is a thorough man," he said. "You know Porter." "I know his handwriting," she said. "He wrote to Gerald asking questions about Edmund in October. Gerald mentioned it because he was alarmed, and I was not, and I told him so." She closed the notebook. "I assume you have read the report." "Yes." She looked at him then, and her expression was not the expression he had been braced for, not fury, not pain, not the particular reproach that he had rehearsed responses to during the coach journey south. It was simply the expression of a woman who has been managing a clear-eyed understanding of the facts for a very long time and does not need to rehearse it for anyone. She said, "Edmund is well. He is here tonight, in the nursery. He is 2 years and 4 months old, and he is in excellent health, and he is an extremely intelligent child. She paused. You may see him, if you wish, tomorrow, at Gerald's house on Half Moon Street. I wish, he said. She nodded once. 8 o'clock, she said. He is at his best in the morning. She tucked the notebook under her arm. Excuse me, Your Grace. The second warming dish needs repositioning. He watched her walk across the room, not hurriedly, not dramatically, simply with the quiet efficiency of someone who has a list and intends to work through it. And he stood at the edge of Lady Carrington's ballroom and understood, with perfect clarity, that he had been an extraordinary fool for 5 years, and that the question now was not whether he could undo it, but whether he could do something worth doing instead. He did not say anything. He simply stayed. She had not slept well, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who gave her nights to worry. But the morning came clear and cold, and she was dressed and downstairs by 7, reviewing a set of household accounts that a new client had sent, while Edmund ate his porridge at the small table near the window, with the solemn concentration he brought to all meals. He was a compact, serious child with an air of perpetual assessment, and he regarded the porridge bowl as though measuring it before committing, which she found genuinely funny every morning. At 5 minutes past 8, there was a knock at the front door, and Gerald's housemaid, a cheerful woman named Bridget, came to say that the Duke of Ashford was in the hall. Edmund looked up from his porridge. He had heard the knock. He noticed everything. She closed the accounts folder and said, Ask His Grace to come up, please, Bridget, and remained at her own chair with her hands flat on the table, which was the posture she used when she needed to feel the solidity of things. Ashford entered the morning room and stopped in the doorway. She watched him see Edmund for the first time, watched the specific stillness that came over him. Not shock, exactly, but the expression of a man whose intellectual understanding has just become a physical reality. Edmund looked at the tall, dark-coated man in the doorway with the particular deliberate attention he applied to all new information, and said nothing, which was his standard initial posture toward people, and which Cordelia had always privately admired. She said, Edmund, this is the Duke of Ashford. His Grace has come to say good morning. Edmund considered this information. Then he said, with the gravity of a 2-year-old completing an important social formality, morning. Something in Ashford's face did a thing she did not entirely have a name for. He came forward, not abruptly, and crouched down to Edmund's level at a respectful distance and said, Good morning, Edmund. That looks like excellent porridge. Edmund looked at the porridge. He looked at Ashford. He appeared to reach a conclusion. Sit, he said, and pointed at the chair opposite. Ashford sat. It was not the conversation she had imagined for 5 years, and then stopped imagining, because she was not a woman who spent energy on imaginings she could not act upon. It was something else entirely, quieter than anything she had prepared for, more specific, threaded through with the precise and ordinary details of a small child at his breakfast, and it was, in the way of all the most difficult truths, much harder to remain composed through than anything dramatic would have been. She returned her attention to the accounts folder and let them have their morning. He came back the following day, and the day after that. The third morning he brought a set of wooden building blocks of a particular quality. Cordelia recognized them as the kind made by a specific craftsman in Bloomsbury, which meant he had done research before going to the shop, which was the kind of thing she noted and filed without comment. Edmund received the blocks with the approval of a man inspecting inventory, and immediately began stacking them in a configuration she recognized as structurally ambitious. On the 4th morning, Ashford arrived and said, before he sat down, I owe you an explanation. She said, You owe me a great deal more than that, Your Grace, but we can begin there. He sat. He gave her the explanation with the same quality he gave everything. No excess, no performance, no attempt to position the facts more favorably than they were. His mother's death, the withdrawal, the failure of courage he had committed in September of 1812, the two replies and then the silence, which he named accurately and without excuse. She listened with her hands still and her eyes level, and when he finished, she said, "I know why you stopped writing. I worked it out some time ago." It did not make it simpler. "No," he said, "I don't imagine it did. She brought everything she had, and she put it to work. That was the only way she had ever operated. 'What do you want, Your Grace?' she said. 'Not what you think is right, or what you believe you owe. What do you want?' He said, 'I want to know my son. I want to know you. I want to spend the rest of my life in a house where someone corrects the grain yield figures and I am not the most competent person in the room.' He paused. 'I want to marry you, Cordelia. Not because Edmund requires it, though he does, and not because the circumstances demand it, though they do, but because I have not, in 5 years of trying, managed to stop thinking about a woman at a Herefordshire dinner table who knew exactly what she thought and said it at precisely the right moment, and I am reasonably certain that attempting to stop for another 5 years will produce the same result." She looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has heard something they need to measure before responding. Edmund was building a tower in the corner with considerable structural ambition. The morning light was coming in at a low angle across the accounts folder. She said, "I will think about it." He nodded. He did not press. He stayed for Edmund's morning and helped stack the blocks back into the box when Edmund lost interest and left at 9:30. She thought about it for 3 days, which was 2 days longer than he deserved and 1 day shorter than she needed, and at the end of 3 days she had a very clear understanding of what she was being asked, and what it would cost, and what it would offer, and what the honest calculation was, and she carried that calculation with her to the morning room on the 4th day and said, when he arrived, "Yes, but I have conditions." He said, "Of course you do. Name them." She named 6. He agreed to all 6 without negotiation, which told her something, and then he said, "I have one of my own. I want you to bring Edmund to Ashford Hall for Christmas. It is his estate too, and he should know it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That is reasonable." He did not smile, but something in the quality of his attention changed in a way she recognized, like a well-built bridge settling properly into its foundations. The trouble arrived from 3 directions at once, which was at least efficient. Lady Sophia Marchmont had been in Ashford's orbit for 2 years, placed there, with all the careful engineering that high society brought to these arrangements, by the combined efforts of 3 interconnected families who had decided, some time before Ashford himself was consulted on the matter, that she would make an appropriate duchess. She was beautiful, credentialed, and fully equipped for the role in every external sense, and she was not unintelligent. She had simply made the mistake of certainty. Cordelia first encountered her at a dinner arranged by a mutual acquaintance in the 2nd week of December, before the Christmas party at Ashford Hall, and Lady Sophia looked at her with the polite and calibrated attention of a woman examining a thing she has not been told to take seriously. "Miss Ashworth," she said, with the particular warmth that is the social equivalent of a door being held open before being closed, "I understand you are in household management." "Among other things," Cordelia said. "How useful," said Lady Sophia. Cordelia had been managing this category of remark since she was 27 years old. She said with complete pleasantness, "I find it so. Lord Carrington found it useful when I recovered £400 annually in vendor margin for the Carrington household this autumn. Lady Hargreaves found it useful when I identified the discrepancy in her estate solicitor's billing that had been running unnoticed for 3 years. Useful tends to multiply in my experience." Lady Sophia smiled. Of course. She had not expected the specifics. That was always the difficulty with the general dismissal. It did not survive contact with actual numbers. The second direction was Lord Reginald Ashford, the Duke's uncle, who served as the family's de facto patriarch in the absence of any surviving Ashford of the older generation. Lord Reginald was not a bad man. He was a thorough one. He arrived at Gerald's house on Half Moon Street on a Tuesday morning, having sent a card the previous day, which was courteous enough to be given credit for, and sat in the drawing room with the considered posture of a man who has decided something is his responsibility and intends to discharge it without malice. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I will not pretend this is a comfortable conversation. My nephew's situation is irregular. The child's existence adds a dimension that makes the irregularity more pressing. I am not opposed to the child being recognized and provided for. I am less certain about the proposed marriage." Cordelia said, "I see." She did not say it coldly. She said it with the accuracy of someone who is taking in information. Lord Reginald continued, "James is the Duke of Ashford. His marriage will determine the alliance connections of this family for a generation. The woman he chooses must be capable of managing that role. The household, the social obligations, the accounts," Cordelia said, "the creditor negotiations, the tenant farm management, the household staffing decisions, the event planning for a major estate, the drafting of contract clauses that protect the estate's interests." She met his eyes. "I have been doing all of those things for 11 years, my lord. I have been doing them without title, without credit, and without salary. I can provide documentation for every year of it, if that would be useful." She opened the folder she had brought. "I brought documentation in any case." Lord Reginald looked at the folder. He looked at Cordelia. He said, after a moment, "What kind of documentation?" 11 years of accounts," she said. 3 creditor negotiation records with outcomes. 2 annotated contracts I drafted for the Ashworth estate. A set of estate reports from 1813 to 1816 in my handwriting, which Gerald can authenticate, and which record the decisions that kept that estate solvent during the agricultural depression years. She placed the folder on the table between them. "I am not asking you to approve of me, Lord Reginald. I am offering you evidence, which I believe is more useful than approval." He took the folder. He opened it. He read for 4 minutes in silence. The third direction was the institutional circle, the whisper campaign that had begun running through the drawing rooms of London the moment the connection between the Duke of Ashford and Miss Cordelia Ashworth became visible. She had no illusions about whisper campaigns. They were social architecture, not individual malice, and they functioned by repetition and the absence of contradicting information. The version running about her was the standard one for her situation. She had contrived the child to trap a duke. She was after money and position. She was unsuitable in 17 specific ways the whisperers were happy to enumerate. She had heard 3 versions of it before December was out. She did not argue with it. She continued doing her work. The Christmas party at Ashford Hall required 3 weeks of preparation, and Cordelia arrived a week before the guests to begin the operational work. Ashford Hall was in Northumberland, a stone house of considerable size and some years of understaffed management, and it showed. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Grantham, was efficient but stretched thin across a household that had been operating with half the appropriate staff since the late Duchess died 7 years before. The estate accounts were kept accurately but not intelligently. The entries were correct but the patterns were invisible, which meant that recurring problems were being solved from scratch each time they arose instead of being anticipated. Cordelia sat with Mrs. Grantham for 4 hours on the first afternoon and went through the accounts with the attention she gave everything, and at the end of 4 hours she had identified 3 structural inefficiencies, a vendor billing pattern that had been costing the estate £40 annually in overpayment, and 2 staffing arrangements that were producing conflicts they didn't need to produce. She did not present these findings as criticism. She sat beside Mrs. Grantham at the kitchen table and said, "Here is what I see. Tell me what I'm missing about why it's arranged this way." And Mrs. Grantham, who was a sensible woman, said, "No one's ever asked it that way before," and they worked through it together. By the second day, the hall maid, a young woman named Alice, had brought Cordelia her morning tea without being asked, and had mentioned, with the careful indirection of someone testing the social weather, that it was very good to see the morning room being used properly again. Cordelia had sat with Edmund that first evening in the nursery that Mrs. Grantham had prepared, and Edmund had looked around the room with his standard deliberate inventory, and had approved of the block's shelf and the window seat, and the particular slant of the late afternoon light, and had gone to sleep in a house that was technically his father's, and would one day be his own, apparently untroubled by the irony. She was in the library on the second evening when Ashford found her. It was past 10 o'clock, and she had brought the vendor billing record to check against the last 3 years of purchase logs, and she was 3 pages into the comparison when she heard him come in. He stopped at the door, assessed the scene with the brevity of a man who processes arrangements quickly, and said, "That is the East Wing vendor account." "It is," she said. "Sit down if you like. I am nearly through the comparison." He sat in the chair across from her and watched her work. She was aware of this without it being uncomfortable. His attention was not the kind that required response. After perhaps 5 minutes he said, "What have you found?" She told him. The vendor had been billing a standard rate that had not been renegotiated since 1807, a rate that reflected supply costs from before the war levies, meaning the estate was paying a legacy premium on every quarterly delivery that no longer corresponded to the actual market rate. 22 deliveries over 10 years. The cumulative overpayment was in the range of £380. He said Porter didn't find that. "Porter was looking for people," she said. "I look for numbers." There was a pause that had the quality of something settling rather than something suspended. He said, "You brought the documentation to my uncle. I told you I would document everything. He sent me a letter this morning," Ashford said. He said, and I quote precisely, "She is not what I expected." He did not say it warmly, but he said it. Cordelia closed the accounts folder. She had been managing accounting for 11 years, and she had learned that a partial acknowledgement from a man who believed he was right was worth more, strategically, than a warm endorsement from one who had already agreed with her. She said, "That is enough for now." Ashford looked at her across the library table, and his expression was the one she was beginning to recognize, the one that was not cold and was not warm, but was something older and more specific, the expression of a man who is looking at something he had not expected to find and has made the decision to look carefully instead of looking away. He said, "Your cravat has been tied incorrectly for the past hour. The left side is lower than the right." She had not said anything about it when he sat down, because it had not been the moment. Now she stood up, came around the end of the table, and straightened it with 4 efficient adjustments. He sat very still through this. When she finished, she stepped back and returned to her chair, and he said, in a voice that had something different in it, "It has been crooked all evening, hasn't it?" 40 minutes, approximately, she said. "I was going to mention it when I reached a natural stopping point." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Cordelia." She met his gaze. He said, "Thank you." It was not what she had expected. She had expected something more formal, more significant. She had expected a declaration, or something that looked like one. What he gave her instead was something simpler and, because it was simple, harder to put away. She picked up the accounts folder and returned to the page she had been reviewing, and he stayed at the library table for another hour, reading, and neither of them spoke again, and the fire in the library grate drew steadily, and the house was quiet above them. She had managed the cold for 5 years. She could manage warmth. She played the pianoforte on the 3rd evening. after Edmund was in bed, because she had found a piece of music in the hall's music cabinet that was in a hand she recognized as not a printed edition but a personal copy. The notation slightly idiosyncratic, the tempo markings written in a slanted style that was too particular to be commercial. She had asked Mrs. Grantham, and Mrs. Grantham had told her it had been the late Duchess's, that she had written out her favorite compositions in her own hand and kept them in the cabinet, and that no one had played them since her death. Cordelia had sat with the piece for 20 minutes before deciding. It was a Haydn composition, the slow movement of a sonata, and it was within her range, and it was 7 years since anyone had played it in this house, and it deserved to be played. She had not heard him come in. She finished the movement and sat for a moment in the silence, and then Ashford said from the doorway, in a voice that had something she had not heard in it before, "Where did you find that?" "The music cabinet," she said. She turned on the bench. "I asked Mrs. Grantham. I hope I have not." "No," he said. He came into the room and looked at the music stand. "She used to play that in the evenings. I had not heard it in some years." She said carefully, "I know what it is to have a house go quiet after a person leaves it." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the room held them both for a moment the way a room does when something true has been said in it, and she understood that this was what the ledger of 5 years was made of. Not just absence and silence, but the specific wound that had produced both, and that she was holding it now, in the music room, with his mother's handwritten Haydn open on the stand, and the only thing she had to give him was the recognition that she had already given him, the same clear-eyed, accurate seeing that she brought to accounts and vendors and everything else. She said she was careful with her notation. The tempo markings are very specific. He sat in the chair nearest the pianoforte. She was careful with everything, he said. She played the second movement. He did not leave for an hour and a half. The formal dinner was held on the 20th of December, and Cordelia had organized it with the same thoroughness she brought to Lady Carrington's ballroom. Timing sheets, revised seating, candle placement reviewed twice, warming dishes confirmed at the appropriate distance from the serving path. The guest list included Lord Reginald and 3 other family-connected households, Lady Sophia Marchmont among the invited, and 2 of the estate's senior investors who had dealings with the Ashford-entailed property. Cordelia was seated, at Ashford's deliberate instruction, at the right side of the table, not the lower end. Lady Sophia noted this and said nothing, which was itself a kind of information. The difficulty presented itself in the 3rd course, when Mr. Hartfield, the senior of the 2 investors, made a remark that was intended as a genial observation, but landed differently in the room's acoustics. He said, looking down the table with the confidence of a man who holds mortgages on 3 of the Ashford agricultural properties, "It's an unusual domestic arrangement, Your Grace. One imagines there are more conventionally suitable candidates for the position." The table had a suspended quality for a moment. Lord Reginald, Cordelia noticed, did not agree audibly. She said pleasantly from her chair, "Mr. Hartfield, the yield reports on the Ashford tenant farms are in the estate library, if you have not reviewed them recently. The farms have been underperforming the county average by 11% for the past 3 years, recoverable through 2 contract adjustments and a drainage investment that will pay back in 2 seasons. I have drafted both adjustments." She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been keeping an accurate count. "I imagine a man with a financial interest in the estate's performance finds that relevant." Hartfield looked at her. He said, "You have drafted the contract adjustments." "With pleasure," she said. "I will have them on the library desk tomorrow morning." He did not say anything further about conventionally suitable candidates. Lady Sophia, across the table, looked at Cordelia with an expression that was not warmth but was the specific recalibration of a woman intelligent enough to recognize when a situation has changed. She said nothing. She applied herself to the fourth course with the composure of a person completing a social evening she had accepted on different terms, and when she left that night she said to Cordelia, in the entrance hall, "You are not what I was led to understand." She paused. "That is not an apology. It is simply accurate." "I know," Cordelia said. "I rarely am." The Investor Council met on the 22nd of December in the Ashford Hall Library, by arrangement between Ashford and his solicitor, a man named Whitmore who had served the family for 15 years, and who had met Cordelia 3 days prior, and spent 4 minutes asking careful questions before deciding, with the efficiency of a man who trusts his own assessment, that she was precisely what she appeared to be. The council comprised 4 men: Hartfield, 2 additional investors with holdings in the Ashford Agricultural Syndicate, and Lord Reginald, who attended as family representative. Cordelia had been told she could remain in the morning room. She brought the accounts to the library instead. She set the annotated ledger on the table. 11 years of accounts, the vendor records, the 3-year yield comparison, the drafted contract adjustments with her marginal notes, and a single summary page listing 19 documented findings, organized by recoverable impact and timeline of resolution. She placed it in the center of the table and said, "I know this was arranged as a meeting between His Grace and his investors. I am asking for 10 minutes before it begins." Ashford, at the head of the table, said, "You have them." Lord Reginald looked at the accounts folder. He had seen it before, and his expression was the one she had begun to recognize from him. Not approval, not warmth, but the specific look of a man who is revising a position he held with less evidence than he believed. She stood and presented 19 findings in 9 minutes. She did not argue. She did not charm. She walked through the numbers with the precision she brought to everything, citing page and line reference for each figure, noting the supporting documentation column, addressing each investor's specific portfolio where it was affected. The 3-year yield gap, recoverable. The vendor billing error, documented overpayment of £380. The 2 contract adjustments, she read the relevant clauses aloud. The drainage investment, she had 3 comparable county examples with timelines and costs. The room did not immediately erupt. There was a long moment, the kind that comes after a thing has been made undeniable, where the people present are catching up to what the numbers have already said. Hartfield said, at the end, "The contract adjustments. Did you draft both of these yourself?" "Yes," she said. "Mr. Whitmore reviewed them yesterday. He made 2 amendments which I incorporated." Whitmore, from his chair near the window, said, "I amended minor wording for clarity. The substance was entirely sound." Hartfield looked at the summary page for a long moment. He said, "This is £380 in recovered overpayment, plus 11% yield improvement potential. With a conservative margin," she said, "it could reach 14%. The person who had been overlooked in this room for the past 20 minutes was doing the work of making the room stand, and everyone in it knew it now." Ashford stood. He said, "Miss Ashworth has been managing accounts of this quality for 11 years. She has been doing it without title, without salary, and without credit. I intend to remedy that. I am asking this council to accept Miss Ashworth as the future Duchess of Ashford." He looked at Lord Reginald. "I am not asking for approval. I am informing the council of a decision I have made, and providing the evidence on which it is based." Lord Reginald said, after a silence that had weight in it, "The accounts are thoroughly documented." "They are," Ashford said. Lord Reginald looked at Cordelia. He said, and it cost him something she could see and gave him credit for anyway, "I was wrong about what you could do." He paused. "I was not wrong about the complexity of the situation, but I was wrong about you, Miss Ashworth." She said, "I know, Lord Reginald. Thank you for saying it." He nodded once. He did not add warmth to it, because he was not that kind of man, but the acknowledgement was real, and it was complete, and she filed it in the category of things that were simply true. Hartfield said, "The contract adjustments, when can these be executed?" "January," she said. He turned to the other two investors. An agreement passed between them that didn't require spoken form. He said, "We have no objection to the match." Ashford looked at her across the library table, and he did the thing she had not expected, the same thing she had not been expecting since the beginning, which was to do the more than required thing when less would have sufficed. He came around the end of the table. He said, "Cordelia." He went down on one knee, in front of the council, in front of Lord Reginald, in front of Hartfield and Whitmore and the winter light coming in at the library windows, and held out his hand. She looked at him for a moment. She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table, feeling the solid wood, and then she gave him her hand. He kissed it, her bare hand, because she had not been wearing gloves for a working morning, and the room was very still. She said, clearly enough for everyone present to hear, "Yes, you may stand now." He stood. He did not release her hand immediately. Whitmore, from his chair near the window, made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. The church was in the village 2 miles from Ashford Hall, and they were married in January on a morning that was cold and clear and still, the kind of Northumberland morning that arrived with a specific quality of light that Cordelia had begun to think of as belonging to this place in the way that things belong to places you have decided to stay in. Edmund attended in a small coat that Mrs. Grantham had sourced from the village seamstress, and stood with Bridget during the ceremony, with the serious attention he brought to all important events, and at the moment the ring was placed, he said, in the carrying voice of a 2-year-old who does not yet know that weddings require quiet, "Ring." Cordelia heard the small ripple of warmth move through the 12 witnesses, and did not permit herself to smile until she was safely facing forward again. The private moment came that evening. Edmund was in bed. The hall was quiet. She was in the morning room at the desk, not working for once, simply sitting with the ledger closed in front of her. And Ashford came in and sat across from her and said, without preamble, "I want to say this properly, not in front of a council, and not in front of witnesses." She waited. He said, not because it was necessary or appropriate, or because Edmund required a father in a properly organized household, though all of those things are true, because I have spent 5 years being less than I should have been, and in the 6 weeks since I came back into your life, I have been more than I knew how to be, and the difference is you. He paused. Because you are the most capable, the most precise, the most genuinely particular person I have ever encountered, and because when you straightened my cravat in the library I felt, for the first time in years, like a man who was known by someone rather than simply assessed. Another pause. And because Edmund has your eyes when he is thinking and mine when he is finished deciding, and that is the most accurate thing about the two of us, and I find it. He stopped. She said, "Extraordinary." "Yes," he said. She thought about it for a moment. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, without haste, turning it over to find the accurate measure of it. It was not rescue, and it was not repair. It was the specific recognition of a person who had been doing excellent work in an invisible room for 11 years, and had simply, at last, been seen by someone capable of seeing clearly. She said, "I know." She met his gaze. "I know, James." It was the first time she had used his name. He did not say anything. He simply stayed. In the quiet morning room at Ashford Hall in January of 1818, and she returned to looking at the closed ledger, and the fire drew steadily, and outside the window the Northumberland night was cold and still, and completely without drama, which was, she thought, exactly right. Edmund grew up knowing this house from his first winter, which meant he grew up knowing every corridor and every drafty window and every place where the east wing collected damp, and by the time he was 4 he could find the morning room by smell alone. ink and cedar and the particular warmth of the fire his mother kept at a consistent height, because she was not a woman who tolerated cold when she could do something about it. He had his mother's dark red hair, and his father's gray eyes, and his mother's precise attention, and his father's particular stillness. And he had, by the age of 5, opinions about ledger organization that were not always correct, but were never uninteresting. The contract adjustments Cordelia had drafted went through in January of 1818 as scheduled. The yield improvement reached 13.5% by the following harvest season, above her conservative margin, below her optimistic one, which she privately considered a satisfactory outcome. The vendor billing correction recovered £382, and the corrected contract was used, with Whitmore's endorsement, as a template for 2 other Northumberland estates whose managers had written asking about it. In 1820, she formalized what had been an informal set of practices into a document she called simply an Estate Management Accounting Guide. 43 pages of annotated ledger practice, creditor negotiation frameworks, contract clause guidance, and yield analysis methodology, written in the plain working language she had always preferred. Whitmore had it copied and distributed to 11 northern estate households. By 1824, she had received correspondence from 6 of them noting outcomes, and she had revised the guide once and was considering a second revision. Lord Reginald died in 1821 and left her, in his will, a brief letter that said, "You were correct that evidence is more useful than approval. You have my respect, which I should have offered you sooner." She had read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the accounts folder she kept for records of things that were simply true. Lady Sophia Marchmont married a baronet from Sussex in 1819, and was, by all reports, very well suited to the position. Cordelia heard this with the equanimity she brought to all information that did not require action, and returned to her mourning. Hartfield had become, over 3 years of quarterly meetings, something almost approaching collegial. He had never been warm. He did not need to be. On a January evening in 1822, which was exactly 4 years from the night of the private declaration, she was at the morning room desk reviewing the second draft of the estate guide, and Ashford was reading near the fire, and Edmund, who was 6 years old and should have been in bed, came padding down the corridor in his nightclothes, and appeared in the doorway in the particular way of a child who has decided that the rule about bedtime does not apply to him specifically. Ashford looked up from his book. Edmund looked at the fire with the expression of a man assessing whether a particular chair would suit him. Then he came in, climbed into the chair beside his father, and settled. Ashford looked at Cordelia. She looked up from the accounts and saw them there, the dark-coated man with the precise attention and the small red-haired child with his father's gray eyes, sharing a chair in the firelight of the morning room as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world, which it was, which it had been for 4 years, which it would continue to be. She knew he was watching her. She looked back at the guide and made her notation and said, without looking up, "Edmund, you have 12 more minutes, and then Bridget takes you back." Edmund said, 15. She said, 13. "Done," said Edmund. Ashford said nothing. He simply put his arm around his son and returned to his book, and the fire in the morning room grate drew steadily, and outside the Northumberland night was cold and entirely clear, and Cordelia Ashworth, Cordelia, Duchess of Ashford, continued her work.